Hi, everybody. Thanks very much. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm going to talk a little bit about how we see the future of urban mobility at VIA. And if you watch car commercials, you could be forgiven for believing that this is what your experience is going to be like if you buy a car. When in reality, we all know that oftentimes this is what your experience is like once you drive off the lot. And this is the problem that we are trying to solve. It's fundamentally a problem of too much demand for a very limited, constrained infrastructure, and what happens when that infrastructure becomes overwhelmed. And you could imagine that simply putting more people into every one of these cars would solve this problem. In fact, in the United States, 85% of people commute by car, and of those, 90% of those are commuting alone. So if we could get people to share their ride, that would help. And we've been trying to do that effectively with the bus for many, many decades. And unfortunately, oftentimes what ends up happening is this. We see that the buses, while some are full and can be quite efficient, many times are empty. And this has many causes, many factors, including the fact that the bus runs on fixed routes and fixed schedules. It's always the same very large vehicle. It's not dynamic. It doesn't adapt to data. And you might then be forgiven for worrying that maybe there's no solution that can help us here unless you're planning to scoot everywhere. And we believe that there is hope. And what we've done here on the left is taken some data from the Brookings Institute in the United States, where they took the 100 largest metropolitan areas and ranked them from 1 to 100 based on the quality of their public transit system, 100 being best. And as you can see in blue, as the quality of the public transit system gets better, exponentially more and more people are utilizing that public transportation system until you get to a city like New York, where over 50% of residents are commuting by public transit, and correspondingly, as you can see in orange, the better the public transit system, the fewer people who own a car. And again, until you get to a city like New York, where effectively the public transportation system has won. It has won a majority share of the market, and fewer than 50% of households, and that includes even more remote parts of New York City, like the outer boroughs, Staten Island, the Bronx. Across that entire area, fewer than half the households own a car. So we know we have hope if we provide a good enough public transportation system. The problem is that digging a subway, which is what's required in order to provide a system like we have in New York or London or Paris or Tokyo and several other cities, all of these cities, what they have in common is that they've got a tremendous subway system. And digging a subway system is extremely expensive, prohibitively so, and deploying a subway system across every one of those 100 largest metropolitan areas in the US is probably not going to happen. So how are we going to tackle this $7 trillion a year global ground transportation market and solve this congestion problem? And the solution that we believe in at VIA, that I believe in, is dynamic shuttles. So on-demand, dynamically routed, smaller, more agile vehicles that can be summoned on your phone and hopefully convert your experience from what we saw earlier to this. These seem like pretty happy people. And fundamentally, what a dynamic shuttle does is it takes what we have on the left, which is your traditional bus, which, as you can see, runs this fixed route, this line, through, in this case, a small city in England, and really only serves you if you're within a certain walking distance, a certain radius of every one of those stops. So if you live, work, or play outside of those little circles, you're probably rather poorly served by the bus unless you plan to walk quite a large distance. On the other hand, with a dynamic shuttle, what you could do is replace that system or complement it, if the bus is sufficiently efficient already, with this very dense network of what we call dynamic virtual bus stops. So each one of these dots is a virtual bus stop that the system can direct you to walk to, and you can book a van, as shown on the right, that can take you from any one of these virtual bus stops to any other of these virtual bus stops, and you're always within perhaps a few hundred meters at most of any one of these virtual bus stops. And the system is much more agile, relies on these smaller vehicles, it's asset light, and fundamentally doesn't require any new infrastructure. In fact, the infrastructure, we like to say, is the data that allows the system to become increasingly more efficient. And what we have found over the last few years is that cities are increasingly becoming interested in these types of solutions. So whereas a year and a half, 2 years ago, we would go meet with a city and we would tell them about this vision, and we would say, you know, we've got this software and it's working pretty well in New York and a few other places, they would look at us and say, gee, thank you for coming. It was a pleasure. You guys are cute. And that's about as far as we would get. Today, we're seeing a completely different picture. There are many, many cities around the world, I'd say tens of cities, including some of the largest cities, Singapore, LA, London, Sydney, and many more, who are actively experimenting with these forms of microtransit or dynamic on-demand transit. And that's because, as we know, the infrastructure is overwhelmed and congested. Building a solution that really works like a subway is extremely expensive. Bus solutions are unfortunately not sufficiently efficient, and increasingly tax dollars, public dollars, are more and more scarce and are more heavily scrutinized. Taxpayers are asking, what are you doing with my tax dollars, and why is that bus running every hour almost entirely empty? And it turns out that in order to run a system like this, you actually need fairly sophisticated technology. So simply having this system, just to give you one example, of dynamic virtual bus stops often requires a very different computation from one that simply takes you from point A to point B. So the advantage of the virtual bus stop is clear. If you're standing on, say, in Lisbon on a very large boulevard and you're standing on the wrong side of the street, if you cross the street, you can save that vehicle a pretty significant series of U-turns in order to get to you, and then U-turn back to head in the right direction. The problem is that once you've got this cloud of virtual bus stop that we could send you to, and a cloud of virtual bus stops on the drop-off side, and you've got maybe several tens of vans that you could be assigned to, and within each van there are multiple passengers, so there's an ordering question. Are you going to be first? Are you going to be third? When you multiply out all of those permutations, all of a sudden you're looking at a problem that went from finding the shortest path from A to B to finding perhaps tens of thousands, if not 100,000 different route solutions for all of these combinations of pickup, drop-off, vehicle, and ordering. So the computation for solving this is significantly more complex, and we have discovered that if you don't do this, if you don't actually think about the problem as an on-demand bus service, but rather simply think about it as an on-demand taxi, you don't have the mapping and the routing that's required, you don't think very hard about how many vehicles you need at every time, so you simply allow as many vehicles that want to come onto the system show up whenever they like, you're not going to achieve the seat utilization and the efficiency that you need to keep the cost per seat down and justify the system as a public transit system. And what we find and this is some of our data from cities in which we have deployed a service like this, is that across pretty much every operational metric, whether it's demand, utilization, wait times, and particularly the cost per every ride, we see a significant improvement versus what I would call legacy systems or the bus. So just to give you a little bit of sense of VIA for a moment, more specifically where we are currently operating across nearly 40 different cities or have agreements to launch in these cities or different locations. We are partnering with cities, with transit authorities, and with sometimes corporations to launch corporate shuttles or college shuttles. And as you can see, we've completed over 40 million rides. In New York, Chicago, and Washington, D.C., which is where we started in New York, expanded to Chicago and D.C., we operate a two-sided marketplace, a consumer service that transports over 1.5 million people a month. And that service, very much like an Uber or a Lyft, connects passengers with drivers. Really, you could think of it as a marketplace for seats. We have also partnered with our good friends at Mercedes-Benz, at Daimler, with MB Vans to launch a company called Via Van that was mentioned earlier, that operates a consumer service in London, Amsterdam, Milton Keynes, and Berlin. And we're very proud of this company and this partnership. And to dive into one specific example, we have worked very closely with Daimler and with the BVG, which is the local public transit authority of Berlin, to launch a Via Van service in Berlin. This service effectively required a special permit. It was not allowed by local Berlin regulations to operate a shared dynamic transit service like Via. So we partnered with the BVG, and the BVG was able to convince the Berlin Senate to provide us with a special license to operate this service. And about a couple of months ago, we launched this service called Böllkuning that you can see here. It is the largest publicly operating dynamic transit fleet that's connected to a local public transit service. It is also the largest such electric fleet. 80% of this fleet in Berlin is electric. And I think it's a beautiful example of how when a company that's bringing a new technology to the market can work with the city and the transit authority to launch an innovative service, it can complement the existing services, the bus, the tram, the subway, all of the services that the BVG is operating extremely effectively in Berlin. We can add to that and provide a solution for when you need to get from between 2 points that aren't well served by the existing public transit service. And lastly, I just wanted to show you a few examples of all of the different services that we operate around the world. As you probably saw on the map, there's VIA service in Tokyo, in New Zealand, in Australia, and many such services in Europe. We're entering the Middle East, and of course the United States and South America. As a summary, I would say this technology is available today. It is not autonomous driving. It is not something that is going to come. We have seen it work extremely well in cities large or small, dense or sparse. Any urban environment where people need to get from point A to point B efficiently, conveniently, and inexpensively, a system of this sort of dynamic shuttle, we believe, has a real place. And it works very efficiently, doesn't require new infrastructure. Currently operating in a few tens of cities, and we hope to soon be in thousands. So thank you very much.